I wanted to do a artist talk about the two-person exhibition that I'm in when Unearthed Sites Collide, which it's with me and Shireen Kalatbari and curated by Shireen Makaramis, who is also at Winslow House with me right now. This is gonna be kind of like a deep dive because I wanted to have a chance to just monologue and kind of get into all the details with y'all. It's currently on view at SFAC and until December 14th. So that's what's going on. I'm gonna start with this piece, which is like my first piece when you enter the gallery. It's a drawing of a painting that I made when I was a teenager. It's of a person that's underground and their arm is kind of like up, gesturing like towards the sky, and then there's like a little sprout that's coming out from the soil. So this painting, the original painting that the drawing is based off of, did a whole series around this theme of like a person that was growing into a tree, and it was inspired by the short story that I read when I was a teenager called The Magician's Tower. Yeah. So in this story, the protagonist, over the course of the story, she doesn't know that this is happening till the very end, but she is becoming a magician. And a big part of her evolution is this like shift in the way that she experiences her connection to nature and also to time. There's a scene where she's like cutting a piece of bread at home, and then her mom asks her like, why are you cutting that bread so slowly? And she said describes how it's because like as she's cutting the bread, she's experiencing like the wheat growing and it being touched by the sun and like the hands of the people gathering the wheat. So there's this like really her whole life and experience, there's like more like a porosity between like her and her environment that's happening in the story. The line that really moved me from that was this line about that was describing her transformation as if she was like this seed that was buried underground and then her hands were opening like leaves. So that's what like compelled me to do this whole series of work when I was younger. And I made this drawing this year, like for the show, because there's another piece that I'm gonna go to now. It's like a really pivotal piece in the show for me, and kind of the origin of a lot of my thinking around it. It's this piece, this stained glass, where it's a woman that is turning into a tree, which I like designed this or like thought of the idea for it, and then later on realized like how connected that was to my childhood work. So this is inspired, well, it's like a scene. I'm like really thinking of this like in a way like depicting a scene from this novel, The Vegetarian by Hong Kong, which was originally written in Korean and then translated into English some years ago. Anyway, but I came across this book at all and I like heard about it and grabbed it, and I think it was like end of last year, maybe more like early this year. It's a story that's a very rough summary, but it's a story about a woman who has a nightmare which is pretty gruesome, and she feels implicated in the violence that's part of that dream, and in response she decides to become a vegan. And then by the end of the book, she actually has decided she doesn't want to eat any food at all because she just wants to eat light. She believes she's turning into a tree. And there's a scene where she's been institutionalized by her family, but she escapes and is found naked in the forest doing a headstand. And so that's what this piece is. The novel, it's never written actually from the protagonist's perspective. It's always written from the perspective of like people around her, who are all reacting to the choices that she's making, in their own kind of ways. Particularly like there's like a lot of, anyway, I'll get into that in a second. Anyway, so she's doing this headstand in the forest, and I wanted to depict that, and like as like I thought of this as like a way of honoring her and like honoring these decisions that she had made. In essence, like I was thinking about this story as this protagonist is like making these choices about how she's going to live, and it's like a lot of it's like about her ethics, and it's these choices around what's going to come into her body. And while wow, she's making this choice about herself that are like a lot of it I really feel like is like this commitment to nonviolence. And then everyone around her is having a reaction. It was written at a time when it was pretty uncommon to be vegan in Korea, so that's part of it. But there's also this, while it is like her narrative, the story that's like about her, but I think when I was reading it, I could see it framing these like larger political things about when someone is making a choice to do something that's like a nonviolent action or a protest, that like in choosing this path, it reveals that there's like a choice, right? That there's an actual choice that like we might be going about our day to day and not being conscious of like the ethics of these like daily choices that we're making, and that this like somebody choosing to shift the system and like the way that they're engaging with it exposes like the violence of the system, and also exposes that we are all like agents, like active agents that are making these choices. Yeah, so the people around her in this novel, many of them respond in these like pretty aggressive ways. Like yeah. And I wanted to have this piece be something that I chose that scene because it's a scene where she's creating, like, I wanted to show like my interpretation that like what she was envisioning and her reality is real. I made this piece. I only just learned stained glass this year for this show. I made it with Angie at Oko Design, so really grateful for her help with that. And I want to keep doing stained glass. So that's that piece. And then after I'd read The Vegetarian, soon after that I read another novel called The Center by Isha Siddiqui. And in that story was this contrast to The Vegetarian, and it's kind of like working around some themes that are similar and still using this like eating as this way of talking about it. And I think eating ended up being this really like this big like starting point for me for the show, because I think it gets to this aspect of, you know, like every time I eat, I'm choosing to survive, I'm choosing to keep on living, and also I have to like, you know, it's a choice to nourish myself, and it is a nourishing act, but at the same time it's like a moment where I'm feeling very aware of, or I can, if I'm like choosing to think about it, I guess I can become very aware of like all the ways that me being able to survive and nourish myself, it's embedded in like the exploitation of other people and other creatures and other life. And I was thinking about like that mentality that I get into when I'm realizing that, which can sometimes lead to like a paralysis. And the way that I'm living, like I'm not an activist or a martyr, but and there's like all these like compromises, like ethical compromises that I'm always making with my life, and my survival, and that's part of what like I've felt so struck by The Vegetarian, because she's making these choices, like that protagonist is like making these choices where she is essentially kind of like being a martyr, and she's living like having this like ethically pure path, and in The Center, the protagonist is making very different choices. I'm not going to go too much into that plot right now, because it's like I end up spoiling it if I like talk about it too much. But she's making very different choices. Maybe I will spoil it. She essentially is wanting to be a great literary translator, and in pursuing this goal, she inadvertently consumes other humans' bodies in order to like learn languages. So there's obviously a lot in there, but that part about eating where she is doing like what we consider like, you know, like the worst thing imaginable, right? Which also in the context of the book, there's this is sort of like gradually revealed to her, and then when it is revealed to her, there's these like men who are the founders of the school that are really trying to like justify why this like process of cannibalism is acceptable. So she's like getting all this stuff from them about it, and it's like spiritualized. That made me think about communion. So I grew up in the church. I grew up Christian. Communion is a ritual where the congregation is invited to eat bread and wine, and those are symbolic, or for some people they literally are, the body and blood of Jesus. It's a ritual that I don't want to describe it. If you're like not familiar with it, it probably sounds like really gruesome, but it's something that like I grew up with and felt like very normal at the time. But yeah, with this ritual, it's like evolved over time. Originally, it was kind of more of this communion was more like about people coming together and like sharing this meal. But then as Christianity became more and more like embedded with empire, then it became a ritual where there's like little if you've seen my little like ceramic cups I've made, those are like communion cups. There's like little cups and like little pieces of bread, and it's doled out, and there's all these rules about it, and like there's an altar and like the pastor and the priest. It's not about like community and sharing in the way that it had been at another point in time. And that's something that like I think about with this work, is like how these different symbols have evolved over time. But yeah, communion is this ritual that's about eating and about like sacrifice, and like that aspect of it felt very connected to these other stories that are about like eating and choices around eating. And eating being this like really transformative act, because like with communion, that's like this way of like getting forgiveness, and it's part of like this whole like eating the body of God, like being with the community, for your sins being forgiven by Jesus' sacrifice, like et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, when communion was happening when I was a kid, I had all this like anxiety around it, because I had heard different rules and thoughts about who was allowed to take communion and who wasn't. There's this aspect of like potential spiritual risk if I took it and I wasn't ready. I also didn't want to not take it and then have other people in the congregation and like my family see that I wasn't taking it. So I made a practice of right before communion started, I would be like, oh, I gotta go to the bathroom. And then I'd leave the pews and go to the back of the church and then get a drink of water at the water fountain there. And it was like this really crisp, cold water. And I have like a really really lovely memories of like drinking by that water fountain. So for this show, I remade that water fountain, and I was thinking of it as this portal into another world, and wanting to get into like that somatic experience of drinking water. And then these pews that Jonathan Bout made, I asked him to make one pew that was like a minimalist pew, and then one that was turning into a tree. This is what he did, and they came out really amazing. Really grateful for this collaboration. And at one end of the pew, you'll see these booklets. I wrote a story and then collaborated with Daniela Tinoco with Recibidor Press to make these booklets. They're titled Eating as Becoming, and they tell that story of like me as a child in church, but it's retold in this like more abstract way. I have a mythology that I've been writing since about like 2021 in this myth, and I use that as like a way to frame my visual art practice, and just like I like to write. Yeah, so in this mythology, there's two different worlds. One of them is called the room, and that is an abstraction of institutional spaces. Primarily, I'm drawing from the church, especially with this show. There's like a lot of like church stuff in there. Yeah, so yeah, there's the room, and I'm thinking about like the sensory, like somatic experience of being in institutional environments, and being like a community like that. And the water fountain exists like in the room, and then in this narrative that like I like follow that water from the water fountain into the other world. It's this portal. The water is like leads into the other real world, which is called the roar. The roar is like based off of my experiences in like different landscapes. Like I'm thinking about nature, and it's a way of like a space where I want to, like I'm developing the kind of spirituality that I'm interested in now, and exploring that in the like imaginative, like kind of fantastical way. One of the creatures in my world is called the Pymorphia, which that creature goes between different spaces. It's based off this word called the Pythonomorphia, which is an evolutionary theory that snakes came from the water, yeah, as opposed to land. But I use that creature to like talk about different different creatures. like there's like a snake, there's the snake, big snake element to it, and I think of them as like a creature that is able to change and adapt and like move between worlds in a very fluid way. I didn't talk before about the dragon on the wall that's behind the fountain, but I'm gonna get into that. I'm gonna talk about it now. So there's a dragon there that is, I wanted to look a little bit like a water stain. It also kind of came out looking like smoke, but there being this like elemental shifting movement to it. So I was mentioning about how like I'm trying to like learn other forms of spirituality and think about that. And one of the ones I was introduced to Saju, which is a Korean tradition, like astrology tradition, some years ago. Started looking into that a bit, and then later had like another reading with someone who does Bazu, which is like a Chinese tradition. And both of them, there's like many different traditions that are all like with different names that you could like say are part of like a larger family of astrological traditions called Four Pillars of Destiny. So if you know about like zodiac animals, you know how like we're Year of the Dragon, that's part of that system. So this year is Year of the Dragon, and I learned based off reading Alice Sparkly Cat or Ace's writing that in Bazu, the dragon, and like just like East Asian dragons are, you know, like they're long, right? They don't have wings, and that's because they are based off of rivers, like they're symbolic of rivers. So when I was like thinking about that water from the water fountain, following that then becomes this like river, that's river, that's also the dragon, that's also like the Primorphia that I referenced in my writing, this creature that's water. And dragons were once a symbol of the people because people would go to rivers, like communities and towns were formed around rivers. So I wanted to, and like that's like the space, and rivers are the space where like life is proliferating. Like there's rivers aren't just like a river somewhere. Like there's like, wanted this to be like a river that was in a forest. So you'll see that these sculptures, which are made out of slime, I actually made them in the gallery because they're so long and like kind of fragile. So I'm really glad we had 4 weeks of install, which I'm really, really grateful for. So I got to like make these in the gallery. Shreen also like made their tower in the gallery. We both like use the space to like, I don't know, to the max, I guess. Yeah. So dragons, right? Life is proliferating around rivers. So these slimes are hung by this thread that is the green, that's kind of like that green of the wall. It's like a little bit off. There's actually 3 different colors of it because I wanted there to be these like layers. And there's pine needles that are hanging off of those. So those I was thinking of as like forming the lines of trees, that kind of like mimicking the way the lines are for the trees in the stained glass as well. So this river is in a forest. The house I grew up in, there's this really, really tall pine tree that was actually originally a Christmas tree that someone else had planted in the front yard. And it was so, so tall, and I had a lot of memories like being on that tree. And pine is also this, like when I learned, can be used for like cleansing, like spiritual cleansing in like the Korean tradition. So I'm thinking I wanted to bring pine in because of that. If you look at the slimes or the sculptures that are like a river and like a dragon, you'll see inside them there's tiny little like squares of bread. That's communion bread. And I also put rice in there because I think of the bread for communion, like, yes, it's positioned as this like sacred element, but also thinking back to some of the original, maybe not original, but like early ways that communion was practiced, it actually was more about like, it's just like a carb. It's just like a carb that you eat all the time, like it's like more like a daily bread vibe. And so I'm kind of gluten-free. Anyway, I eat a lot of rice. I mean, I love bread too, but I can't eat it that much. So I wanted to put rice in there as like my like daily carb to be embedded in there. And yeah, so Then, all right, I was talking about rivers and dragons, so, and how like people gathered around rivers, right, and like formed communities and towns. So dragons were then the symbol of the people, but then later on, that symbol was co-opted by someone who was trying to like gain power, and then dragons became associated with like royalty. This is all things I learned from Ace. Highly recommend their writing, Alice Sparkly Cat. I love like using the ground in my artwork. So this large rug, I invite people to sit on it and to touch it. And then on the wall, you can get really close to all these small sculptures. This is a collaboration I did with Tani Tane. As she lives in my building and is somebody that we do like rituals together often. Like when it's the full moon, we often are like reading tarot, or like hanging out on the roof and like looking at the stars. And I wanted to do a piece with Tani. I mean, first because I admire her work as a whole, but also like it's not just her artwork, but her artwork is embedded into her life, and like it's embedded into her way of living, the way her like living space is. And also she does a lot of collecting of things. So we didn't, I don't think we bought, maybe we bought like one thing, but essentially like nothing was bought for this entire, all the pieces you see here, even the shelves, they actually, her partner Tuyen found these wood scraps. They were offered to him because there's like a wood shop nearby, and they had these scraps, and I was like, they offered them to him, and then he offered them to us. So we have like, which like perfectly fit the whole, the aesthetic, like the vibe of the space. So I really love those. But yeah, anyway, back to Tani. So she like saves things and collects them. You'll see lots of like this is like lychee shell. Like there's all these different pieces and bits of things that she pairs together, and that's part of her like way of, I think just in general as a person, she's like approaches her whole life with that kind of like seeing value and having this like spirituality about her that I really admire, that I think is like just like there's like an integration to her life. Yeah, maybe that's part of what it is that like I really admire, and I see her and feel like I'm like, oh, like I just admire her a lot, and want to embody a lot of the ways that she lives. And then I also brought in many of my objects, like some of those communion cups I mentioned are in here. I wanted to represent like all the zodiac animals, so you'll see them. Mostly they're here, but they're also in like different parts, a few other parts. And there's lots of like little hidden things. So definitely look close at these, and you'll discover more little details. Yeah, I'm really grateful to have collaborated with her, and I wanted this area to be full of life. Like there's a spirituality in, I think like sometimes the way that spirituality is conceived, or like when I've thought back to some of my experiences in like very like, you know, cathedrals and things like that, it's like you walk in and it's just like expansiveness, and also like that can be an experience with like in nature, right? Like when you're at the top of a mountain, you're like looking out at a viewpoint, like that sense of awe. I think I have some of that. I have like, that was sort of, I got that sprinkled in with the hanging sculptures and this like river and this like large moment. But I really wanted there to be these intimate moments and also like sweetness and cuteness, because I want that to be part of my spirituality. And I want that aesthetic to be, like part of the work as well. Yeah. So those are the main things I was gonna say, I think. Oh, you'll see at the end of this wall, there's this magician card. This comes from Tani's deck. And actually way early on when I was like just starting to work on the show, we did like a tarot reading together, and I pulled the magician card, a different one. But she wanted to include this too, because like to have like a cat represented, which is I think it's like in the Vietnamese zodiac system, like a cat is one of the animals, and because it was the magician card, so we just thought it was really perfect. And then there's a rice noodle in there. Tanya had this incredible idea with the shelves of using this as like rice paper that's been like molded to create the shelves, and her name Tanya actually means seed in Japanese, And that's something that she talked about really early on after she was like, I talked to her about my show, and she was thinking about her practice too, and how there's like inside and outside, and like using seeds and peels are like speaking to, and also like the food thing, of course, too, are kind of like speaking to a lot of those themes I'm working with, and like narratives that I'm working with. Okay, I think I talked about a lot of this stuff. Yeah. I think I will just end with saying, like, thank you for listening to this and being interested in my work. Many thanks to like my collaborators. I really like feel, and like thanks to SFAC. Like I'm just like I felt so honored and lucky to get the resources that this program provided, and to be able to like work at SFAC, and then really wanted to like bring other people into this experience, and also I couldn't have done it without my collaborators. So want to like say thank you to Jonathan Bout that did the pews and made my frames, Tani Tane, loved our collab, and Daniela Tinoco. Those booklets you can get at the gallery if you want, and I love how they came out. And yeah, this also obviously love both Shireen's, the artist and the curator. We had, yeah, I love how the work all came together, and it was 4 weeks of install. So also shout out to T and Matt for doing all of that. Yeah, and everyone at the gallery. Now I'm just like listing everyone, you guys. Okay, I'm gonna stop because it's getting really long. But yeah, if you want to see the show at the gallery with me, let me know. I'm planning to be there Wednesday, December, I think it's the 4th. And then for the closing on the 14th, I'll be there like all day, and we have a really cool program for the closing as well. I'll put that info in the caption and in here. Okay, thank you, bye.